Imagine a world where the dead were kept at the dinner table, where love potions contained ground-up mummies, and where gladiators' blood was sold as medicine. These weren't scenes from a horror story. They were everyday realities in ancient civilizations. From the shadowy temples of Egypt to the grand arenas of Rome, our ancestors practiced rituals so bizarre, so unsettling, that modern society would recoil at the mere thought of them. But here's the chilling truth. What we now consider forbidden, taboo, even was once as ordinary as brushing your teeth. Why did ancient cultures embrace what we now fear? The answer lies in the fabric of their beliefs, where life and death, magic and medicine, sacred and profane blurred into one. Picture a priest chanting over a bowl of human ashes, or a healer prescribing crushed skulls for headaches. These weren't acts of madness. They were rooted in deep, unshakable convictions about the universe and humanity's place within it. And today, we're about to uncover 25 of these forbidden practices, each more jaw-dropping than the last. This journey won't be for the faint of heart. We'll walk through forgotten crypts, decode cryptic scrolls, and piece together the unsettling rituals that shaped history. Some will shock you, others might make you question how far we've really come. But one thing's certain, by the end, you'll never look at the past the same way again. So take a deep breath, because we're stepping into the shadows where ancient secrets wait, whispering truths too strange to ignore. Human sacrifice wasn't just a dark legend. It was woven into the very foundation of ancient societies, a sacred duty to keep the world in balance. Among the Aztecs, priests performed rituals so precise they'd rival modern surgery. Victims were led up pyramid steps, their chests sliced open with obsidian blades to offer still-beating hearts to the sun god Huitzilopochtli. The bodies tumbled down the temple steps, where their limbs might later be ceremonially eaten by nobles. Archaeologists unearthed racks holding thousands of skulls in Tenochtitlan, some with holes drilled through the sides, testaments to gruesome public displays meant to showcase divine power. Across the ocean in Carthage, children weren't spared from ritual slaughter. When drought struck or wars loomed, wealthy families surrendered their firstborn sons to the fire god Baal-Hamon. Excavations revealed burial sites called tophets, jars filled with tiny charred bones alongside engraved stelae reading, "To the Lord." Some scholars argue these were already deceased infants given ceremonial cremation, but mass graves tell a darker story, generations of parents who believed burning their child would bring rain or victory. Even relatively peaceful cultures participated. Celtic Druids allegedly predicted the future from death throes, while the Maya painted ball players as sacrificial offerings in their art. These weren't mindless acts of cruelty but desperate bargains with forces beyond human control, where a single life might buy a year of harvests or stave off apocalypse. The chilling truth, to those who practiced it, sacrifice was as rational as paying taxes or planting crops. The gods demanded blood, and humanity paid in the only currency that seemed to matter. The weight of human sacrifice pressed not just on the victims but on entire civilizations, leaving psychological scars we're only beginning to understand. Modern archaeologists examining Aztec burial sites found evidence of mass post-traumatic stress skeletons with telltale signs of chronic malnutrition and healed fractures, suggesting generations raised under the shadow of ritual violence. Imagine growing up knowing your name might be drawn next, or watching your sibling ascend those blood-slicked temple steps. This wasn't just ceremony, it was collective trauma weaponized by rulers. Religious fervor turned the unimaginable into the inevitable. Maya murals depict sacrificial victims in trance-like states, their faces eerily calm, brainwashed or drugged to embrace their fate as divine vessels. Priests spun elaborate myths that the sun would die without fresh hearts, that crops would wither without spilled blood, and when drought came anyway. The sacrifices doubled, rulers like the Aztec Emperor Ahuitzotl turned public executions into spectacles, carving obedience into the populace with every falling body. But perhaps most chilling is how these societies rationalized the horror. Spanish chroniclers wrote of Aztec mothers who proudly offered their sons, believing death in the temple guaranteed eternal glory. Carthaginian merchants buried amulets with their sacrificed children, tiny clay hands clasped in prayer, as if to say, this was necessary. The line between devotion and delusion blurred until murder felt like mercy. Today, we see echoes of this mindset in extremist cults and wartime propaganda. The same psychological levers, fear, divine promise, twisted love, still bend human behavior to unthinkable acts. What the ancients called duty, we now call atrocity. Yet there remains whisper a warning. Given the right beliefs, any society can be taught to kneel before the blade. In the mist-shrouded highlands of Papua New Guinea, the four people practiced a form of cannibalism that blurred the line between grief and devotion. When loved ones died, women and children consumed their brains during funeral rites, not out of hunger, but to absorb the departed spirit and ensure their memory lived on. This sacred act, called endocannibalism, carried horrific consequences. An epidemic of curu, a fatal brain disease, passed through contaminated tissue. Entire villages were decimated by uncontrollable tremors and laughter-like seizures, yet the ritual persisted for generations. To the fore, abandoning the practice meant abandoning their dead to oblivion. Halfway across the world, the Aztecs turned cannibalism into statecraft. Conquistadors wrote of temples where captives' flesh was cooked with maize and chilies, served to nobles as symbolic communion with the gods. Warriors believed eating an enemy's heart transferred their courage, a spiritual protein shake for the battle-hardened. Bernal Diaz del Castillo described banquets where golden platters held meticulously portioned human meat, accompanied by cocoa and flowers. But this wasn't mere savagery, it was cosmology in action. The Aztec universe demanded constant nourishment, and what sustenance could rival human life itself? Even the supposedly civilized had their exceptions. During the siege of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., historian Josephus recorded mothers secretly eating their infants to survive Roman blockades. Famine peeled back civilization's veneer, revealing how thin the layer between ritual and desperation could be. Modern medicine now understands prion diseases like curu, and forensic anthropology can identify butcher marks on ancient bones. But science still struggles to explain the psychology behind these acts, how love, faith, or war could twist sustenance into sacrament. Perhaps the most unsettling truth lies not in the consumption itself, but in how easily humans justify it when beliefs demand the unthinkable. Deep in the oak forests of ancient Gaul and Britain, the Druids performed ceremonies that would make even battle-hardened Romans shudder. These weren't just priests, they were judges, scholars, and masters of life and death, wielding rituals so potent that Julius Caesar himself wrote of their power with uneasy respect. At the heart of their practice flowed blood, both animal and human, believed to hold the secrets of the future and the favor of the gods. Tacitus described grove ceremonies where white-robed druids sliced open the bellies of sacrificial victims, reading omens in the spill of entrails and the patterns of steaming blood on sacred stones. The air thick with incense and chanting, these weren't random acts of violence but precise cosmological calculations. A deer's blood might predict the success of a harvest, while a prisoner's dying spasms could reveal the outcome of war. The Druids saw the universe as a living, breathing entity, and blood, the very essence of life, was their ink for deciphering its will. Then there was the wicker man. Towering effigies woven from willow branches, their hollow bodies packed with living offerings, sometimes cattle, sometimes prisoners of war, set ablaze in a roaring inferno. Caesar's troops witnessed these horrors firsthand, reporting screams muffled by crackling foliage as the giant figures became funeral pyres. To the Druids, this wasn't mere execution, it was a cosmic transaction. The smoke carried prayers to the gods, and the ashes fertilized the earth in a grim cycle of death and renewal. Modern excavations at Anglesey, a Druidic stronghold, reveal charred bones and ritual daggers with grooves to channel blood flow, tools of a priesthood that believed destiny could be carved from flesh. What chilled Roman observers most wasn't the brutality, but the calm precision with which these rituals unfolded. Each cut, each chant, each spark was part of a vast celestial equation. Yet for all their infamy, Druidic practices reflected a profound connection to nature's rhythms. Their calendar revolved around solar and lunar events, their barbaric sacrifices mirroring the cycles of predation and decay found in every forest. In a world before science, blood was both compass and clock, a sacred language written in scarlet. Today, we recoil at their methods, but their underlying quest remains eerily familiar: to wrest order from chaos even at the darkest cost. High in the Taygetos Mountains, where cold winds cut through the valleys of ancient Sparta, a chilling ritual unfolded every year. Newborns weren't celebrated, they were judged. Plutarch's grim account describes state officials examining each infant, not for health but for potential. Those deemed too weak, too small, or bearing any imperfection were carried to a place called the apotheke, the place of rejection, and left exposed to the elements or thrown into a chasm. This wasn't neglect, it was policy, a cornerstone of Sparta's relentless pursuit of martial perfection. The logic behind this brutality was clinical. In a society where every citizen was first a soldier, survival wasn't a right but an earned privilege. Sickly children risked weakening the gene pool and draining communal resources. Spartan elders believed they were pruning humanity's garden, cultivating only the strongest stock. Even the famed lawgiver Lycurgus codified this practice, weaving infanticide into Sparta's legal fabric alongside mandates for military training and communal living. Mothers bathed newborns in wine instead of water, believing the weak would convulse and die during the ordeal. Natural selection accelerated by human hands. But the horror didn't end at the mountainside. Surviving children faced decades of institutionalized hardship. At age 7, boys were torn from their families for the agoge, a training regime that included starvation, beatings, and ritualized theft to hone stealth and pain tolerance. Girls, though spared infanticide, endured rigorous physical conditioning to bear strong future warriors. The entire system revolved around one unyielding principle: the collective trumped the individual, and the state's needs justified any atrocity. Modern excavations near Mount Taygetos reveal tiny bones bearing no marks of violence, silent witnesses to deaths by exposure rather than blade. Yet what's most disturbing is how Spartan mothers internalized this ideology. Historical accounts speak of women who'd proudly declare they bore sons for Sparta, with no recorded protests against the practice. The line between patriotism and inhumanity dissolved in the face of relentless propaganda. Today, we recoil at Sparta's eugenics, but its shadow lingers. The early 20th century saw pseudo-scientific movements revive similar ideals, twisting Darwinism to justify sterilizations and genocide. Sparta's legacy serves as a dire warning. When societies worship strength above compassion, even the most vulnerable become collateral in the pursuit of an impossible ideal. The rocks of Taygetos still whisper their grim question: how much humanity are we willing to sacrifice on the altar of perfection? The roar of 60,000 voices shook the Colosseum as Aretiarius, his net tangled uselessly in the sand, raised his trident in surrender. The crowd's response wasn't mercy but upturned thumbs, dozens of fists jerking downward in a demand for death. This wasn't mere entertainment in ancient Rome, it was mass psychology weaponized by emperors. Gladiatorial games began as funeral rites around the 3rd century B.C., where wealthy families honored deceased relatives with prisoner executions, but by Julius Caesar's time, they'd morphed into political theater on an unprecedented scale. Caesar himself once staged a games featuring 320 pairs of gladiators, a spectacle so lavish it nearly bankrupted Rome and cemented his popularity with the mob. Behind the bloodshed lay cold calculations of power. Emperors like Commodus didn't just watch the games, they fought in them, carefully choreographing bouts against disabled opponents to sell the illusion of imperial might. The Colosseum's hypogeum, its vast underground maze of elevators and trapdoors, allowed for theatrical surprises. Lions bursting through hidden panels, gladiators rising dramatically on platforms. Even the naval battles were orchestrated deceptions. Historians describe the arena flooded with millions of gallons of water, ships maneuvering in artificial lakes until engineers realized the weight was cracking the foundations. Yet the true genius of the games was their carrot-and-stick duality. Successful gladiators became sex symbols, their faces on oil lamps and frescoes. The graffiti in Pompeii boasts of one fighter's girl's size after victories. Meanwhile, condemned criminals faced beasts or mock crucifixions at intermission, reminding spectators of the fate awaiting dissenters. When Emperor Titus inaugurated the Colosseum in 80 AD, 9,000 animals were slaughtered in 100 days, not just for spectacle, but to showcase Rome's dominion over nature itself. Archaeologists studying gladiator bones from Ephesus reveal surprising truths. Many show healed fractures treated by skilled surgeons, proving some fighters received medical care worthy of modern athletes. Isotope analysis of their teeth tells darker stories: men raised on cheap grain diets, likely slaves or war captives groomed for the arena. The games weren't random brutality, but an industry with trainers, gamblers, and groupies, all feeding Rome's addiction to controlled violence. What chills most isn't the bloodshed, but its normalization. Senators wrote of games as casually as we discuss sports matches, while poets like Martial composed verses celebrating a lion's elegant killing of a criminal. The crowd's roars became Rome's heartbeat, its rhythm dictating emperors' fates. When the Christian monk Telemachus leaped into the arena to stop the violence in 404 AD, they stoned him to death not out of malice, but because he threatened the order they'd come to see as natural as sunrise. In that moment, Rome revealed its deepest secret. Civilization isn't the absence of savagery, but the art of dressing it in ceremony. Hidden in the misty mountains of northern Japan, locked inside ancient temples, sit figures that defy nature's laws, monks who transformed their own bodies into sacred relics through one of history's most excruciating rituals. The practice of sokushinbatsu, or self-mummification, wasn't about death but transcendence. Between the 12th and 19th centuries, certain Buddhist monks embarked on a grueling 1,000-day quest to become living Buddhas, mummifying themselves alive in a bid to achieve enlightenment. This wasn't passive decay, it was a meticulously orchestrated annihilation of the physical self, step by agonizing step. The process began with a radical diet. For 1,000 days, monks ate only nuts, seeds, and bark from the urushi tree, a toxic plant normally used to lacquer bowls. The poison seeped into their tissues, slowly embalming them from within while starving out bacteria that caused decomposition. Imagine the body turning itself into its own coffin, each bite of bark accelerating the mummification process. Next came another 1,000 days of even stricter deprivation, consuming nothing but roots and herbal teas designed to purge all moisture. The monks shriveled, their skin clinging to bone, organs atrophying into leathery husks. But the true horror came in the final act. When the monk felt death approaching, he would enter a cramped underground chamber, its walls inscribed with prayers, and assume the lotus position. A bamboo air tube protruded from the ceiling as attendants sealed him inside with clay and earth. There, in total darkness, he meditated, ringing a bell each day to signal he still lived. When the ringing stopped, the tube was removed and the tomb remained sealed for another 1,000 days. Only then would it be reopened. If the body showed no decay, the monk was declared a Sokushin Batsu, a Buddha in the flesh worthy of veneration. If not, the tomb was quietly resealed, his sacrifice unacknowledged. Of the hundreds who attempted this ritual, only about 24 succeeded. The Yamagata prefecture holds the most famous specimens, their skin stretched taut like ancient parchment, lips curled into eternal silent screams. Modern CT scans reveal the extent of their suffering: shrunken organs, bones fused in meditation posture, stomach cavities filled with the remnants of poisonous tea. Yet to devotees, these are not corpses but vessels of divine will, their glassy eyes forever fixed on some unseen spiritual horizon. What drove these men to such extremes? In the Shingon sect of Buddhism, the physical body was seen as the ultimate obstacle to enlightenment. By conquering decay itself, they believed they could cheat the cycle of rebirth. The irony is palpable, using the body's destruction to escape its limitations. Today, the Japanese government forbids the practice, but the Sokushin Batsu remain enshrined, their twisted fingers still clutching prayer beads, a haunting testament to the lengths humans will go to touch the divine. Their silent presence asks an unsettling question: is enlightenment worth the price of a slow, solitary death in the dark? Beneath the golden sands of Saqqara, archaeologists uncovered a labyrinth stretching for miles, not tombs for pharaohs, but a mass grave for cats. Not dozens, not hundreds, but millions of mummified felines stacked floor to ceiling in pitch-black tunnels. This was no anomaly. Across Egypt, sacred animal cults operated on an industrial scale, turning devotion into a grisly production line where faith collided with commerce in the most unsettling way. Take the ibis, Thoth's sacred bird. At Tuna el-Jebel, scientists found catacombs containing nearly 4 million mummified ibises, each carefully wrapped in linen. X-rays revealed a horrifying truth: many had their necks broken before mummification, their fragile bodies stuffed into pots like macabre canned goods. Worse yet, carbon dating proved some weren't even ibises. Desperate to meet demand, priests packaged fake ibis mummies containing random sticks and feathers, selling them to pilgrims who believed they carried divine blessings. Then there were the crocodiles of Kam Ombo, worshipped as manifestations of Sobek. Workers bred them in artificial ponds, fattening them for ritual sacrifice. CT scans show some crocs were bludgeoned to death as juveniles, their mouths wired shut with reeds so they'd resemble the serene god depicted in temple art. Others were intentionally starved, found buried with the bones of smaller crocodiles in their stomachs, evidence of forced cannibalism before mummification. But perhaps the most disturbing were the puppy mills of Anubis. At the temple of Dendera, excavation revealed mass graves of jackal pups, many just weeks old, their tiny skulls crushed to supply the cult's insatiable demand for Anubis mummies. Priests operated full-scale breeding facilities, churning out sacred animals destined not for life, but for ritualized death. Pilgrims paid premium prices for these mummies as offerings, believing they'd curry favor with the gods. The more purchased, the greater the blessing, turning animal slaughter into a spiritual bulk buying scheme. Modern forensic analysis exposes the scale of this ancient deception. DNA testing at Abydos showed entire warehouses of ram mummies contained only wool scraps wrapped around sticks. At Bubastes, the catacombs held so many feline remains that 19th-century farmers shipped trainloads of them to England to be ground into fertilizer. What began as reverence for divine animals had decayed into ruthless mass production, where living creatures became disposable prayer tokens. The irony is inescapable. Animals worshipped as gods were systematically bred for slaughter, their mummified corpses becoming Egypt's dark mirror to modern factory farming. For all their spiritual symbolism, these cults reveal a universal truth: when devotion becomes demand, even the sacred can be reduced to inventory. The sands still whisper with the weight of millions of tiny bones, not victims of neglect but of piety turned predatory. The sagas speak of Ivar the Boneless carving a blood eagle into King Aila's back, ribs wrenched open like wings, lungs draped over shoulders as a grisly tribute to Odin. But how much of this legendary Viking torture method was truth, and how much was medieval propaganda? Forensic anthropologists have spent decades dissecting the Norse texts and skeletal remains, revealing a horror story tangled between myth and reality. Start with the sources themselves. The blood eagle appears in just 3 sagas, all written centuries after the events they describe. In the Tale of Ragnar's Sons, Ivar's revenge unfolds with ritual precision, salt sprinkled on gaping wounds, the victim allegedly conscious until the final lung was pulled free. Yet historians note these accounts mirror earlier Roman and Christian martyrdom tropes, suggesting skalds embellished the tales to terrify listeners. Even the timing raises doubts. The earliest written mention appears in the 12th century, long after Christian scribes began documenting Viking brutality through a lens of horrified fascination. Then there's the biomechanics. Modern surgeons point out that severing ribs from the spine without killing the victim would require anatomical knowledge Vikings likely didn't possess. A study in the journal Antiquity reconstructed the procedure using pig cadavers, showing that while rib removal was possible, exposing lungs intact would be nearly impossible without rapid, fatal bleeding. Some scholars argue the blood eagle might have been post-mortem mutilation, a symbolic gesture misinterpreted by later writers as torture, but archaeology adds chilling complexity. A 10th-century mass grave in Dorset, England, held a male skeleton with deep, precise cuts along the back ribs. While not a full eagle, the marks align with ritual knife work. Even more telling are Viking Age artifacts, amulets depicting spread-eagled figures and rune stones showing executions with torsos splayed open. These suggest the blood eagle, whether literal or symbolic, held potent cultural meaning beyond mere sadism. Perhaps the darkest truth lies in the purpose behind the legends. The sagas frame the blood eagle as a sacrifice to Odin, the god who hung himself on Yggdrasil for wisdom. By mirroring the deity's suffering, the Vikings may have believed they were gifting their enemies a sacred death-twisted honor in brutality. Or, as some linguists propose, the term blood eagle was metaphorical, describing the spreading red stains of a back hacked by swords. What remains undisputed is the blood eagle's power in the Norse imagination. Whether historical fact or embellished nightmare, it cemented the Vikings' reputation as masters of psychological warfare. Their enemies didn't just fear death, they feared becoming legend, their agony immortalized in verse. In that sense, the blood eagle soared far beyond its victims, casting shadows we still struggle to pass today. The real horror may not be whether it happened, but how eagerly centuries of storytellers believed it could. In the silk-draped chambers of Song Dynasty China, little girls as young as 5 endured a ritual of pain that would shape their lives and leave skeletons whispering horrors centuries later. Foot binding wasn't merely fashion, it was a 1,000-year symphony of suffering where broken arches and folded toes became the ultimate status symbol. The process began innocuously, soaking feet in warm water with herbs, trimming nails painfully short. Then came the bandages, 10 feet long and 2 inches wide, wrapping each foot so tightly that toes snapped under the pressure, forced downward against the sole. Over months, the bandages tightened further, crushing the 4 smallest toes inward until they pressed against the raw underside of the foot, the goal. A 3-inch lotus foot, its namesake borrowed from the revered flower, its shape mimicking a delicate crescent moon when balanced precariously on wooden platform shoes. Archaeologists examining bound feet in Shanghai's museum collections found shocking deformities: metatarsals snapped like twigs, heel bones driven upward into the ankle, creating a grotesque arch that turned walking into torture. Women with lotus feet moved in mincing steps, their swaying gait romanticized as willow in the wind, though in truth it resulted from bones grinding against each other with every movement. Infection was rampant. Toenails often grew inward, causing abscesses that could turn septic. Some historical accounts describe finding maggots nesting in the folds of flesh where toes had fused. Yet bound feet became fetishized. Erotic poems described them as fragrant hooks, and Qing dynasty pillow books advised men to caress them during intimacy, comparing the mangled feet to golden lotuses emerging from silk. The psychology behind this practice reveals layers of social engineering. Initially popular among court dancers in the 10th century, foot binding spread through the upper classes as a mark of elite idleness, proof a woman never needed to labor in fields. By the Ming dynasty, it became a prerequisite for marriage, with matchmakers demanding to inspect brides' feet before considering dowries. Families who spared their daughters the agony risked social ostracization. Bound feet were literally a girl's ticket to survival. Village sayings warned, "No lotus feet, no husband," while mothers who hesitated were shamed with proverbs like, "If you love your daughter, bind her feet. If you love your son, send him to school." Even more unsettling was the economic machinery sustaining the practice. Specialized foot-binding workshops employed teams of women to craft the elaborate silk shoes, some no larger than a teacup. Emperors collected concubines with the smallest feet like rare jewels, fueling a grotesque competition where noble families vied to produce daughters with increasingly extreme deformities. By the 19th century, an estimated 2 to 4 billion Chinese women had undergone the ritual generational complicity enforced by mothers who saw it as their duty, despite knowing the agony firsthand. The end came abruptly in the early 20th century when reformers like Kang Yaowei petitioned the emperor to ban what they called this mutilation of innocence. Christian missionaries established natural foot societies, offering financial incentives to families who rejected the practice. Yet even after official bans, some women secretly continued binding well into the 1950s, their twisted feet having become inseparable from their identity. X-rays of elderly women in remote villages show bones that never healed properly, permanent souvenirs of a beauty standard that conflated suffering with virtue. Today, the last surviving women with bound feet serve as living museums, their shuffling gait a haunting reminder of how deeply culture can carve itself into flesh. The lotus foot phenomenon forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When society elevates pain as prestige, even the most brutal traditions can flourish for a millennium. Those delicate silk slippers in museum cases aren't just artifacts, they're shackles disguised as art, whispering stories of beauty bought with lifetimes of agony. Ancient Mayan rulers didn't just drink their hallucinogens, they took them in the most direct route imaginable. Ceramic vessels excavated from tombs and temples show a startling scene. Gods and attendants kneeling over nobles, administering psychedelic enemas with long-necked syringes. These weren't crude medical treatments but sacred portals to the spirit world, where fermented frog toxins, morning glory seeds, and potent mushrooms were delivered straight to the bloodstream through the intestines. The effect, a faster, more intense trip than swallowing, could ever provide visions crashing over the recipient like a tidal wave of divine revelation. The chemistry behind these rituals was as precise as it was bizarre. Scholars analyzing residue in spouted vessels found traces of bufotenin, a hallucinogenic compound from the skin of Colorado River toads. Mixed with alcohol from fermented maize or honey, it became a viscous, mind-altering cocktail. Other pots tested positive for LSD, a chemical cousin to LSD derived from crushed morning glory seeds. But the real genius lay in delivery. Rectal absorption bypassed the stomach's acids, allowing nearly pure psychedelics to flood the nervous system. A surviving Maya codex depicts a king convulsing on his throne, eyes rolled back as serpentine deities spiral from his mouth, likely an accurate portrayal of the violent, immersive trips these enemas triggered. Ritual enema administration became high art among the Maya elite. Painted vases show attendants blowing into syringes to pressurize the liquid, while deities like the paddler gods hold enema bulbs like sacred scepters. Some vessels even feature carved censers beneath the spouts, suggesting the psychedelics were heated for faster absorption. The act itself was deeply symbolic purification through forced expulsion of demons, followed by spiritual rebirth as the drugs took hold. Nobles may have fasted for days beforehand, lying on jaguar pelts as priests chanted over them, transforming a physiological process into cosmic theater. Archaeologists discovered one particularly chilling set of enema equipment in a royal tomb at Tikal, a ceramic syringe shaped like a cormorant, its long beak forming the applicator, still stained with residues of fermented balchet tree bark. Nearby murals show the deceased king receiving just such an enema from a masked shaman, his body contorted as spirit jaguars burst from his torso. This wasn't recreation, it was a sanctioned form of divine possession, where rulers chemically hijacked their nervous systems to commune with ancestors. Modern neuroscience helps explain why this method terrified and enthralled the Maya. Rectal administration delivers compounds almost instantly to the inferior hemorrhoidal vein, which connects directly to the liver's metabolic pathways. Within minutes, users would experience full-blown dissociation far more abruptly than with oral ingestion. Shamans likely exploited this sudden onset, interpreting the violent purging and convulsions as signs of spiritual battle. The famed Dresden Codex even includes astronomical charts paired with enema dosages, suggesting celestial events dictated when and how much nobles should take. Yet these rituals came at a brutal cost. Skeletal remains of Maya elites show chronic rectal trauma, lesions and scar tissue from repeated enema abuse. Some rulers may have developed toxic psychosis, their brains permanently rewired by relentless psychedelic bombardment. One account describes a king who, after years of ritual enemas, began demanding live human sacrifices mid-trance, convinced the gods spoke through his convulsions. The line between conduit and madman blurred until the very practice meant to legitimize power instead eroded sanity. What began as sacred communion spiraled into something darker, proof that even the most spiritually lofty traditions can decay into self-destructive obsession. Those ornate enema vessels now displayed in museums aren't just curiosities, they're relics of a civilization that sought transcendence through chemistry, only to discover that opening the doors of perception sometimes lets in more than light. The Maya sought gods in their guts, but what came flooding back left them forever changed. In the marble-lined gymnasiums of ancient Athens, where oiled athletes trained under the Mediterranean sun, a practice flourished that modern minds struggle to reconcile with Greece's golden reputation. Pederasty, ritualized relationships between adult men and adolescent boys, wasn't hidden in shadow, but celebrated as a cornerstone of education and military preparation. The philosopher Xenophon wrote of it as a sacred bond where the lover imparts virtue and the beloved receives wisdom. Yet beneath this lofty ideal lay a complex web of power, pedagogy, and cultural conditioning that shaped generations of Greek elites. The system followed strict, if unsettling, rules. An harassed lover, typically a man in his 20s or 30s, would court an Eromenos beloved between the ages of 12 and 18 through gifts and poetic overtures. Once accepted, their relationship became public, even honorable, provided it followed protocol. The man was expected to act as mentor, teaching combat skills, philosophy, and civic duty. Physical intimacy, though controversial even then, was framed as an exchange of wisdom for affection, guidance for devotion. Vase paintings show bearded warriors tenderly touching youths' chins while offering hunting spears, the imagery blending sensuality with pedagogy. Military necessity drove much of this tradition. Sparta took the concept further, assigning each young soldier a seasoned mentor who'd share his meals, bed, and battlefield experience. The sacred band of Thebes, an elite fighting force, paired 150 male lovers under the theory that men would fight more fiercely to protect beloved comrades. Plutarch records their graves at Chaeronea, conquerors buried side by side with their partners, bones still interlocked centuries later, but the cracks in this system were visible even in antiquity. Law courts recorded cases of abused boys or jealous lovers. Playwrights like Aristophanes mocked pederastic pretensions, joking about men chasing the smooth-thighed rather than seeking true wisdom. By the 4th century B.C., Athens had laws barring slaves from taking young lovers, proof the practice was becoming a privilege rather than a right. Modern archaeology reveals deeper tensions. Analysis of drinking cups shows symposium scenes where men fondle youths while others look away uncomfortably. Some scholars argue pederasty was less about education than asserting dominance in a society that feared mature male rivals. The beloved's transition to adulthood often meant abrupt separation, leaving emotional scars visible in poetry lamenting lost golden boys. What began as cultural ideal ended as contested legacy. Even Plato, who praised male love in his early works, later condemned its physical expressions as corrupting. The same Greeks who built democracy also built a system where a boy's path to citizenship ran through another man's bed. Their contradictions mirror our own, how societies sanctify what later generations will condemn, how education and exploitation sometimes wear the same laurel crown. The gymnasium's echoes still question us. When does mentorship become manipulation, and when does tradition mask trauma? On the banks of the Ganges, beneath the shadow of towering funeral pyres, a widow knelt in her wedding sari, her trembling hands clasping her husband's lifeless body. As priests chanted ancient verses, she inhaled the acrid scent of sandalwood and ghee, knowing the next breath might be her last. This was sati, the now banned Hindu practice where widows immolated themselves on their husbands' funeral pyres, transforming grief into a grotesque sacrament. The term itself means virtuous woman, but its history reveals a complex tapestry of faith, coercion, and colonial intervention that shook India to its core. Early accounts describe sati as voluntary women choosing death over the hardships of widowhood in a society that stripped them of property, status, even the right to remarry. Inscriptions from the 7th century praise queens who entered the fire to join fallen kings in the afterlife. Rajput folklore glorified Johar, where entire communities of women burned themselves en masse to avoid capture by invaders. But by the Mughal era, records tell a darker story. Widows drugged with opium, their limbs bound with wet ropes that tightened in the heat or pushed back into flames when they tried to escape. Temple carvings at Khajuraho depict sati scenes alongside erotic sculptures, a chilling juxtaposition of devotion and domination. The British colonial period turned sati into a battleground between tradition and reform. Governor-General Lord William Bentinck banned the practice in 1829 after missionaries documented over 800 recorded cases in Bengal alone. His troops dismantled Sati Stone's memorial pillars honoring virtuous widows, yet faced violent backlash. Orthodox Hindus accused the British of cultural genocide, while reformers like Roger Ram Mohan Roy argued sati was never scriptural but a twisted later addition. The debate exposed Hinduism's fault lines. Scriptures like the Rig Veda mention widows remarrying, while medieval texts like the Puranas called sati the ultimate wifely duty. Forensic archaeology reveals disturbing physical evidence. Excavated sati sites show multiple layers of ash and bone fragments, proving some pyres were reused like assembly lines. Chemical analysis of soil near Varanasi's cremation grounds detected elevated mercury levels, suggesting some widows were given toxic courage potions before the flames. Most haunting are the sati handprints still visible on temple walls across Rajasthan, pressed into stone by women moments before their deaths, their fingers splayed in what might be agony or ecstasy. Modern India wrestles with sati's legacy. the 1987 Rup Kanwar case, where an 18-year-old widow burned alive in Diorola, sparked national outrage and stricter laws. Yet villagers still worship at her shrine, leaving offerings for blessings. This duality persists. Legal bans clash with underground devotion, proving how deeply ritual can root itself in identity. Those handprints on the temples endure as silent witnesses to the ultimate question: when does faith become fate, and who gets to decide which flames purify or consume? High in the Andes, where thin air turns breath to ice, archaeologists uncovered a girl in perfect stillness. Her face relaxed, her dresses vibrant crimson, her skin frozen in delicate preservation. This was Juanita, the Ice Maiden, one of the most haunting relics of the Inca Capacocha rituals. Unlike the violent sacrifices of the Aztecs, these ceremonies were eerily serene. Chosen children, often nobility or those deemed physically flawless, were paraded across the empire in a months-long procession before being offered to mountain gods during crises like droughts or earthquakes. What makes these sacrifices uniquely chilling isn't just their scale, but the forensic evidence revealing how meticulously these children were prepared for death. Toxicology reports tell a story of calculated sedation. Hair samples from Juanita and other mummies show escalating doses of coca leaves and chicha, a fermented corn alcohol, in their final weeks. The Incas didn't drag screaming victims to their deaths, they lulled them into acceptance, blurring the line between ritual and euthanasia. Some children's stomachs contained traces of ayahuasca-like compounds, suggesting priests may have induced visions of the spirit world to ease their passage. Frozen at elevations over 20,000 feet, their bodies became time capsules, feather headdresses intact, miniature gold figurines clutched in tiny hands, even remnants of last meals still undigested in their intestines. The logistics of these sacrifices stagger modern minds. Researchers found some victims traveled hundreds of miles from Cusco to remote peaks, their small feet showing calluses from the journey. Oxygen isotopes in their bones confirm they were raised at lower altitudes, meaning they were selected years in advance, groomed like living offerings. Before the final ascent, they feasted on elite foods: maize, llama meat, even peanuts, a cruel irony where the better they were treated, the closer they came to death. At the summit, priests administered a final, fatal dose of chicha mixed with sedatives, then entombed the children in fetal positions beneath stone platforms. The cold did the rest, freeze-drying their bodies so perfectly that 5 centuries later, scientists could still identify frostbite on Juanita's toes. What unsettles most isn't the deaths themselves, but how the Incas framed them as honors. Parents reportedly celebrated their children's selection, believing they'd become divine guardians watching over villages from the peaks. To the Inca, these weren't murders but transformations, the children becoming intermediaries between earth and sky. Modern Quechua elders still speak of them with reverence, leaving offerings at high-altitude shrines. Yet CT scans reveal a darker truth. Some children show signs of terror in their final moments, their lung tissue torn from desperate gasps in the thin air. The line between willing sacrifice and silent coercion blurs with each new discovery. Juanita's face, now preserved in a museum in Arequipa, haunts visitors not for its horror but its humanity. Her slightly parted lips seem ready to speak, her braids still tied with precision. She embodies the central contradiction of the Capacocha: unspeakable cruelty wrapped in sacred ritual, where love for the gods demanded the ultimate price from the innocent. The Andes still whisper with their presence, these eternal children caught between two worlds, their frozen tears long since turned to ice. In the shadow of the ziggurats of ancient Sumer, where the scent of burnt offerings mingled with the perfume of sacred oils, priestesses known as Nadatu performed a duty that would scandalize modern sensibilities. These women weren't just attendants of the goddess Inanna, they were living conduits of divine power, expected to engage in ritual sex with strangers as part of the sacred marriage ceremony. This wasn't prostitution in the modern sense, but a complex fusion of spirituality, economics, and societal control that reveals how deeply intertwined worship and sexuality once were. The ceremony itself, called the Hyros Gomos, reenacted the myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld and her resurrection through union with the shepherd god Dumuzi. Each year, a priestess would embody the goddess, coupling with a king or a chosen stand-in to ensure fertility for the land. But beyond this elite ritual, temple courtyards buzzed with activity as Nadatu offered their bodies to pilgrims in exchange for offerings to the temple. Cuneiform tablets from detail precise payment structures, silver for the treasury, grain for the storehouses, and sometimes personal gifts for the priestesses themselves. Far from stigmatized, these transactions were sanctified, their participants believed to channel Inanna's life-giving energy through physical union. Archaeological evidence paints a vivid picture of this system. Excavations at the Ina complex in Uruk revealed small, curtained chambers surrounding the central shrine, their walls adorned with carvings of intertwined couples. Analysis of soil layers showed unusually high concentrations of myrrh and wine residues, likely used to anoint participants or mask the scent of sweat and sex. Most telling are the cylinder seals found in priestesses' graves, depicting women with raised skirts and men presenting gifts, captioned with phrases like, "Inanna's bounty flows through her." Yet behind the divine facade lay gritty realities. Legal texts from Babylon revealed temple hierarchies where senior priestesses managed junior Nadatu like guild mistresses, taking cuts of their earnings. Some women entered the service voluntarily, seeking independence in a society where marriage was often the only alternative. Others were dedicated as children by families seeking divine favor or financial security. Contracts from Sippar show fathers leasing daughters to temples for set terms, with clauses guaranteeing their return if they bore children. The line between sacred vocation and indentured servitude blurred under temple arches. The practice's decline came with the rise of monotheism, as Mesopotamian religions gave way to Zoroastrianism and later Christianity. What was once a sacrament became sin. The Nadatu's chambers were repurposed as storerooms, their rituals recast as pagan depravity. But the echoes of their world linger in unexpected places. The Brides of Christ metaphor in medieval nunneries, the tantric traditions of India, even the modern debate over sex work's morality. The Nadatu challenge our simplest categorizations, forcing us to ask, when does empowerment become exploitation? And who gets to decide which bodies are sacred or profane? Their legacy lives on in the cuneiform tablets and fragmented temple walls, whispering of a time when the divine wasn't just imagined, but intimately, physically known. The crackle of burning timber mixed with anguished screams as another accused which met her fate in medieval Europe. But flames weren't the only terror. Entire arsenals of specialized torture devices were engineered to extract confessions from those branded as servants of Satan. Take the infamous Iron Maiden, its spike-lined interior more fiction than fact in historical records, yet emblematic of the era's cruelty. Real tools were far more insidious. The dunking stool, where village women were submerged in freezing ponds to test their purity. If they floated, their unnatural lightness proved witchcraft. If they drowned, they died innocent. Either outcome satisfied the mob's bloodlust. Court records from Germany's Bamberg, which trials detailed precision brutality. Needles probed for devil's marks, birthmarks, or scars said to be Satan's branding, while sleep deprivation and thumbscrews wore down resistance. One account describes a 70-year-old midwife confessing to flying on goats after 5 days strapped to the strappado, her shoulders dislocated from repeated drops. The parchment bearing her shaky signature still survives, its ink blotted with what might be tears. This wasn't justice gone awry, but systemic extermination. Between 15 and 1680, Europe executed an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people for witchcraft, 80% of them women. many were folk healers whose knowledge threatened the rising male medical establishment. Herbalists who cured with belladonna found themselves accused of wielding poison. Midwives blamed when childbirth went tragically wrong. The Malleus Maleficarum, a 1584 witch hunting manual, explicitly linked feminine weakness to satanic temptation, urging inquisitors to focus on the midwives, the harlots, and the wise women. Archaeology confirms the horror. Excavations at Scottish witch prisons revealed floors stained with layers of burnt sulfur, a common purification method, while Austrian dungeons yielded witches' bridles, iron masks with spiked tongue depressors to silence screams. Most chilling are the skeletal remains from Pendle Hill, England, showing fractures consistent with witches' ladders, a torture method where victims were dropped repeatedly onto sharp-edged steps. Yet what fueled this frenzy wasn't just superstition, but economic and social unrest. Climate changes, Little Ice Age caused crop failures, while plagues decimated villages. Witches became convenient scapegoats. Their confessions, extracted under torture, mirrored society's deepest fears. One Bavarian woman admitted to summoning hailstorms after losing 7 fingernails to the screw press. Another named neighbors as coven members under the crushing weight of the witch's chair, its seat studded with 500 iron spikes. The trial's legacy lingers in unexpected ways. Modern forensic analysis shows many accused witches exhibited symptoms of ergot poisoning, a mold on rye that caused hallucinations matching demonic possession. Their flying ointments likely contained hallucinogenic herbs like henbane, explaining supernatural visions. Even the witch's familiar, that iconic black cat, may trace to pagan traditions of animal companions, later demonized by the church. Today, memorials stand where pyres once blazed. Cobblestone plaques in Trier mark each burning site, while Finnish museums display the original witches' boats used to drown suspects in icy lakes. These sites force us to confront humanity's darkest trait, the need to blame the vulnerable when the world spirals out of control. The real magic trick of the witch trials wasn't supernatural but psychological. How ordinary people could be made to see monsters in their neighbors and executioners in the mirror. The stench of rotting flesh permeated the temple as the priest adjusted his grisly new skin, a human cloak still glistening with fat and blood. This was the Aztec festival of Tlacaxipulistli, where sacrificial victims weren't just killed but transformed into living garments for the faithful. Captives, often warriors from rival tribes, were strapped to stone platforms and carefully flayed alive, their skins peeled away in near-perfect sheets like macabre banana peels. Then came the unthinkable. Priests donned these dripping skins, wearing them for 20 days until they putrefied, the ultimate act of spiritual transference. Codices depict Xipe-Totuk, the flayed god, with goldenrod skin hanging in loose folds, his very name meaning, "Our Lord the Flayed One." To the Aztecs, this wasn't mere brutality but a profound metaphor for renewal. Just as maize sheds its husk to nourish, human skin represented the cyclical shedding of death to bring life. Ceremonial dances followed, where priests in their human suits jingled with golden bells sewn into the flesh, the sound believed to mimic spring rains. Murals at Teotihuacan show these skin-clad figures sprouting corn shoots from their shoulders, blurring the line between man and harvest. The process itself was chillingly precise. Obsidian blades sliced along limbs and torso, avoiding major blood vessels to keep the skin intact. Some victims were granted a mock battle beforehand, given blunt weapons, and promised freedom if they defeated Aztec champions, a cruel illusion since the fights were rigged. After flaying, the skins were cured with salt and rubber sap, transforming them into stretchable garments that shrank tightly to the wearer's body as they decomposed. Spanish chronicler Diego Duran wrote of priests complaining about maggots burrowing into their legs during the final days, interpreting the pain as the god's blessing. Forensic archaeology confirms the scale of these rituals. At the Templo Mayor in Mexico City, Excavations uncovered pits filled with flaying knives alongside bundles of human finger bones likely severed when shrunken skin grew too tight around the hands. Chemical analysis revealed traces of a chiote dye on some blades, suggesting skins were ritually painted before wear. Most haunting are the stone reliefs showing faces carved in agony, their mouths stretched wide as if screaming eternally, a stark contrast to the serene expressions on priests wearing their skins just inches away. Modern scholars debate the psychological impact on participants. Some argue the priests entered trance states, believing themselves possessed by Zyp-Totic's spirit. Others note how the practice mirrored Aztec warfare tactics. Enemy warriors captured not just for sacrifice but for literal incorporation into the empire's spiritual fabric. The skin's eventual removal held its own symbolism. Priests shed them like snakeskin, casting the rotted flesh into sacred caves representing the underworld. In that moment, the cycle completed, death nourishing life, enemy becoming god, horror transformed into sacrament. What unsettles most isn't the violence itself, but the reverence surrounding it. These weren't secret rites but public spectacles, with crowds gathering to watch the flaying and cheer the skin dancers. Children were brought to touch the decaying garments for blessings, their small fingers coming away sticky with cadaverine. The line between sacred and grotesque didn't just blur, it dissolved entirely. Today, replicas of Zyp-Totic's flayed skin appear in Mexican Day of the Dead celebrations, a testament to how deeply these symbols endure. The stones of Tenochtitlan still whisper with the echoes of jingling bells and sloughing flesh, asking us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that faith can dress even the most horrific acts in the robes of transcendence. On the wind-scoured plateaus of Tibet, where the soil is too hard for burial and wood too scarce for cremation, the dead return to the cycle of life in the most startling way imaginable. Sky burial, or jeta, transforms mortal remains into offerings for vultures, not as disposal, but as sacred almsgiving. Monks chant over the body as a rogiapa, or body breaker, wields his flensing knife with ritual precision. Bones are crushed with mallets and mixed with tsampa flour, while organs are laid out like a grisly feast. Within minutes, the Dakini Tibetan Buddhists view vultures as celestial dakinis, or sky dancers descend in a storm of feathers and beaks, carrying flesh skyward in what's considered the ultimate act of compassion. This tradition traces back to Zoroastrian dakmas, where corpses were exposed in stone towers to prevent soil contamination. But Tibetans infused it with Buddhist philosophy, viewing the body as an empty vessel after death. To cling to it through burial or preservation would be an act of ego, disrupting the soul's journey. The Rogiapa's work, though jarring to outsiders, follows strict protocols. No metal touches the skull believed to house consciousness, and every scrap must be consumed to ensure the soul's release. Witnesses describe an eerie beauty in the efficiency of the birds, some of which wait in orderly rows like monks at prayer. The ecological brilliance of sky burial becomes clear in the high Himalayas. With 80% of Tibet over 10,000 feet, decomposition slows to near halt. Buried bodies might linger for decades. Vultures, nature's perfect recyclers, sterilize remains with stomach acids capable of neutralizing anthrax and cholera. Modern studies show Himalayan griffon vultures can strip a body bare in under 3 hours, leaving only bleached bones, far cleaner than any earth burial. Yet this system now faces crisis. Diclofenac, a livestock drug toxic to vultures, has decimated populations, forcing some monasteries to keep captive flocks. What seems grotesque to some is profound grace to others. Tibetan texts compare the ritual to offering one's body as a mandala, a final act of generosity to nourish all beings. Pilgrims speak of watching a loved one's remains vanish into the azure, not with horror but awe, as if witnessing the soul's literal ascent. The contrast with Western funerals couldn't be starker. No coffins slowing decay, no headstones claiming land, just the wind and wings carrying what was borrowed back to the sky. Archaeologists find evidence of sky burials antiquity in cracked human bones at Neolithic sites across the plateau, marked by parallel cuts from stone tools. Even today, families save for months to transport the deceased to revered sites like Druidic Monastery, where celestial burial grounds perch at 18,000 feet. The ritual persists as both ecological necessity and spiritual rebellion against the fear of death, against the arrogance of permanence. In a world obsessed with preserving flesh, the Tibetans whisper a radical truth that the body's true purpose might be to disappear. Beneath the towering cliffs of Delphi, where the air hummed with the whispers of the gods, the priestess of Apollo perched on a tripod above a crack in the earth, her body trembling, her voice guttural, her words slurring with divine intoxication. This was the Pythia, ancient Greece's most revered oracle, and her prophecies didn't come from divine inspiration alone. Modern science reveals a startling truth. She was quite literally poisoned into prophecy. For centuries, scholars dismissed the ancient accounts of vapors rising from the temple floor as myth. Then, in the 1990s, geologist Gel de Bouwer discovered something astonishing: two fault lines intersecting directly beneath the ruins, seeping traces of ethylene, a sweet-smelling gas known to induce euphoric trances. Laboratory tests confirmed that low doses cause altered consciousness, while higher exposures lead to violent convulsions and disjointed speech. Precisely the symptoms described in historical records of the Pythia sessions. Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi, wrote of the priestess's sudden shifts from calm to frenzy, her voice dropping octaves as if something else spoke through her. The rituals followed a chilling choreography. After days of fasting and bathing in the Castalian spring, the Pythia descended into the temple's inner chamber, the Aditon. There, amid the scent of burning laurel leaves, she'd inhale the rising fumes, chewing bay leaves to amplify the effects. Petitioners watched as her pupils dilated, her limbs twitched, and her utterances, often incoherent, were translated by attending priests into cryptic verses. The gas didn't just lower her inhibitions, it fractured her grip on reality, turning the temple into a theater of chemical divine intervention. Archaeological chemistry adds another layer to the horror. Soil samples from the Aditon show elevated levels of benzene and methane alongside ethylene, a cocktail that would have caused hallucinations, nausea, and long-term nerve damage. Skeletal remains of women buried near Delphi exhibit signs of chronic exposure, degenerative joint disease, and tooth enamel erosion consistent with repeated toxin ingestion. This wasn't a part-time calling, it was a life sentence, but the most unsettling revelation lies in the prophecies themselves. The Pythia's famed prediction to King Croesus, that if he attacked Persia, a great empire would fall, came true in the worst way when his own kingdom crumbled. Was this divine wisdom or the luck of a drugged priestess spitballing riddles? Even the Delphic command, "Know thyself," takes on eerie new meaning when you consider its source. A woman who, under toxic influence, likely didn't know her own name. The legacy of Delphi forces us to confront an uncomfortable paradox. These prophecies shaped wars, founded colonies, and guided kings, yet they sprang from poisoned lungs and a brain under siege. The same fissures that once vented hallucinogenic gases now draw tourists who pose for photos where the Pythia once convulsed. We've traded sacred intoxication for selfie sticks, but the stones still whisper their question. How many of history's turning points were decided not by gods, but by geology and a woman breathing just a little too deeply? Off the reef-swept shores of Hawaii, warriors crafted weapons that carried not just the bite of blades, but the primal terror of the ocean's most feared predator. The leomano, a wooden club embedded with razor sharp teeth, wasn't just a tool of war. It was a sacred instrument of sacrifice, designed to tear flesh in a way that echoed the feeding frenzy of its aquatic muse. Each tooth, carefully harvested from tiger or hammerhead sharks, represented more than lethality. It channeled the spirit of the Aumakua, the ancestral shark gods believed to guide and protect. When wielded in rituals, these weapons didn't just kill, they transformed the victim into an offering, their spilled blood carrying prayers to the depths. The making of a layamano was a spiritual act as much as a martial one. Craftsmen selected teeth from sharks caught in ceremonially sanctioned hunts, often during taboo periods when the ocean's energy was most potent. The teeth were lashed to the club's hard wood base with alona fiber, knotted in patterns mimicking the waves that birthed them. Some specimens held over 200 teeth, each angled slightly outward to maximize laceration. A single swing could flay skin from bone. But the true horror lay in their ritual use. During the Luakini Heiau human sacrifice temples, priests wielded layamano to inflict deliberately slow wounds, ensuring the victim's suffering amplified the offering's potency. The weapon's design guaranteed wounds that wouldn't immediately kill, but rather bleed the victim toward a prolonged, ecstatic surrender to the gods. Yet the shark's influence didn't stop at weapons. Warriors of the Pacific took the mimicry further, filing their own teeth into jagged points to mirror their oceanic counterparts. Early European explorers wrote of encounters with Hawaiian and Fijian warriors who grinned with serrated smiles, their filed incisors dripping with a wakava juice during ceremonial preparations. Anthropologists studying pre-contact skulls found patterns of intentional dental modification so extreme. Some individuals had teeth ground down to sharpened pegs, resembling the very sharks they venerated. This wasn't mere intimidation, it was ontological blurring. By reshaping their bodies, these warriors became hybrids of man and predator, embodying the shark's ruthlessness in battle and its sacred role as a psychopomp guiding souls to the afterlife. Archaeology offers chilling evidence of these practices. Excavations at Palukohola Heiau on Hawaii Island uncovered layamano fragments alongside human bones bearing distinctive parallel cuts, precise matches for the spacing of shark teeth in ceremonial clubs. Forensic analysis revealed some victims had been struck repeatedly while still alive, their ribs nicked by the glancing blows of ritualized violence. Even more telling are the grooved teeth found in burial sites, their edges worn smooth from years of post-modification use. These were not the grins of occasional warriors, but of entire classes of society who lived daily with the legacy of their self-made ferocity. The psychological impact of these transformations can't be overstated. Imagine facing an opponent whose smile alone evoked the ocean's most efficient killer, whose weapons were literally extensions of that terror. Missionary accounts describe battles where the mere sight of shark-toothed warriors caused enemies to flee before combat began. But the reverence for sharks also carried a solemn duality. Their teeth could take life, yet their presence in rituals ensured spiritual continuity. The same warriors who filed their teeth into weapons also offered the first catch of shark hunting season to the Heiau, balancing destruction with devotion. Today, modern Hawaiians grapple with this legacy. Some cultural practitioners revive layamano craftsmanship as an art form, using replica teeth to avoid harming endangered shark populations. Others see the filed teeth in museum collections and wonder at the pain their ancestors endured without anesthesia to become something more than human. The shark's shadow still lingers in these islands, not just as predator but as ancestor, weapon, and divine intermediary. When you hold a layamano, you're not gripping a relic of the past but a key to a world view where the boundary between man and myth was as fluid as the tide and just as relentless. The pipes ran sweet, and the empire drank deeply, unaware that each sip from Rome's glorious aqueducts carried an invisible curse. Those gleaming lead channels that carried water to every villa and bathhouse weren't just engineering marvels, they were slow-acting poison dispensers. Modern analysis of soil deposits along ancient Roman waterlines shows staggering lead concentrations, up to 100 times higher than natural background levels. The wealthier the household, the deadlier the flow. Since lead pipes were a status symbol, their use proliferating in elite homes where water sat stagnant, leaching toxins for hours before consumption. But the true horror wasn't just in the plumbing. Romans deliberately added lead acetate to their wine as a sweetener, calling it soppa, and boiling it down in lead-lined pots until it reached a syrup so concentrated, a single tablespoon could contain lethal doses. Archaeological evidence paints a grim picture of the consequences. Examination of patrician skeletons from Herculaneum reveals lead levels 4 times higher than modern safety thresholds, their bones speckled with telltale deposits. Historical accounts describe Emperor Nero's erratic behavior, his paranoia, insomnia, and violent mood swings, symptoms mirroring advanced lead poisoning. Caligula's alleged madness, including his rumored plan to appoint his horse as consul, may have stemmed from the same source. Even the upper class's well-documented fertility crisis finds explanation in lead's effects. The metal disrupts sperm production and causes miscarriages, a fact corroborated by the sudden drop in aristocratic birth rates during Rome's peak lead usage in the 1st and 2nd centuries. The scale of this self-sabotage becomes chillingly clear when tracing the trade routes. Lead production skyrocketed to over 80,000 tons annually, enough to pipe every major city into oblivion. Monte Testaccio, Rome's ancient garbage hill, contains fragments from an estimated 53 million lead-lined amphorae used for soppa-laced wine. Chemical analysis of preserved Roman wine jars detected lead concentrations up to 1,000 milligrams per liter. To put that in perspective, modern safety standards cap lead in drinking water at 0.015 milligrams per liter. The aristocracy wasn't just indulging, they were marinating their nervous systems in neurotoxins. Yet the most insidious aspect wasn't the physical toll, but the cognitive rot at empire's core. Chronic lead exposure impairs judgment and impulse control exactly when Rome needed visionary leadership. Scholars analyzing senatorial records note a decline in coherent governance paralleling rising lead use, with policies veering between paralysis and recklessness. The Antonine Plague's devastation in 165 A.D. might have been mitigated if emperors like Marcus Aurelius hadn't been battling lead-induced mental fog. His personal writings complain of chronic pain and fatigue, symptoms now recognized as classic heavy metal poisoning. Modern excavations add disturbing context. At Pompeii's House of the Faun, archaeologists found lead water tanks still coated with crystalline soppa residue. Isotopic testing matched the lead to Spanish mines, proving even distant provinces fed the empire's toxic habit. Forensic reconstructions of Roman recipes show soppa was used not just in wine but in fruit preserves, fish sauce, and even infant formula. The poisoning wasn't accidental, it was a cultural addiction, with each generation inheriting weaker bodies and cloudier minds. The parallels to today's public health crises are unsettling. Like Rome, we've embraced conveniences with delayed consequences, from microplastics to forever chemicals. The difference is that Rome never diagnosed its affliction. When Visigoths sacked the city in 410, they found an elite already crippled not just by external foes, but by the sweet, slow venom flowing through their own pipes. The lesson written in those lead-lined ruins isn't about barbarians at the gates, but about civilizations that crumble from within, one poisoned sip at a time. On the misty battlefields of ancient Gaul, victory wasn't measured in territory taken but in heads collected not as mere trophies, but as vessels of supernatural power. Celtic warriors believed the soul resided in the skull, and by capturing an enemy's head, they seized his strength, wisdom, and very essence. Archaeological sites across Europe reveal the chilling scale of this practice. At Tremont in southern France, stone pillars are studded with niches holding human skulls, their eye sockets staring blankly across centuries. At Roquepatus, a sanctuary gateway was reconstructed using actual craniums as architectural elements, their teeth still clenched in eternal grimaces. These weren't battlefield souvenirs, but sacred relics woven into the fabric of daily life. The ritual began the moment a foe fell. Using curved blades called falcotas, Celtic fighters would decapitate their victims with surgical precision, often while the heart still pumped. Roman historian Diodorus Siculus described warriors hanging the heads of their enemies from their horses' necks, then nailing them above their doorways like hunters displaying antlers. But this was more than intimidation, it was spiritual security. A skull mounted above a threshold became a guardian, its trapped soul forced to warn of approaching danger. Some excavated craniums showed drill holes along the parietal bone, suggesting they were strung on ropes and worn during battles or hung from belts as grisly insignias of rank. Forensic analysis reveals the care taken in preserving these macabre talismans. Skulls found at the Ribe-Mont-sur-Anca sanctuary in northern France exhibit cut marks consistent with scalping and defleshing, while others were boiled to remove soft tissue without damaging the bone. Many show signs of prolonged curation, teeth worn smooth from being handled like worry stones, or foreheads polished glossy from generations of ritual stroking. At Bredon Hill in England, archaeologists uncovered a skull placed deliberately in a cooking pit, its cranium blackened by smoke but otherwise intact, suggesting ceremonial feeding of the captive spirit. The psychological warfare behind headhunting was as calculated as its spiritual aspects. Caesar wrote of Celtic tribes displaying the heads of Roman centurions along their borders, arranged to face incoming legions. One such site in the Auvergne region held 30 skulls aligned in a perfect row, all male and aged 20 to 40, their cheekbones shattered from deliberate post-mortem blows, a clear message to would-be invaders. But the practice wasn't limited to enemies. High-status Celts sometimes requested their own heads be preserved posthumously, believing this would allow them to continue protecting their descendants. A Welsh myth even tells of the warrior Bran the Blessed, whose severed head entertained his companions for 80 years before being buried as a protective talisman under London's Tower Hill. What unsettles modern minds most isn't the violence itself, but the intimacy of these rituals. At the Gournay-sur-Aronde sanctuary in France, skulls were arranged in concentric circles around sacrificial pits, some cradled in carved stone basins like beloved relics. Others were found with coins placed over their eye sockets, payment for their spiritual services. The line between veneration and violation blurred until a severed head could be both war trophy and household god. Today, these silent skulls speak volumes about the Celtic worldview. Where we see ghoulish displays, they saw a continuum between life and death, where power could be harvested, stored, and wielded. The clattering of heads on temple gates wasn't just the sound of conquest, but of souls being put to work, a chilling reminder that to the Celts, death wasn't an end, but a transfer of energy waiting to be harnessed by those bold enough to reach out and take it. On the banks of the Ganges at Varanasi, where funeral pyres burn ceaselessly and ashes drift like grey snow, the Aghori monks perform rituals that defy every boundary of taboo. These aren't ancient practices frozen in time, but living traditions carried out by modern-day ascetics who seek enlightenment through the grotesque. Clad in nothing but cremation ashes, their bodies smeared with the residue of the dead, they embody a philosophy so radical it makes conventional spirituality seem tame. The Aghoris don't just confront death, they embrace it, consume it, even sleep atop it, all in pursuit of a single realization: that all duality is illusion and the sacred cannot exist without the profane. Witnessing an Aghori in ritual is an assault on the senses. Some crouch beside half-burned corpses, plucking charred flesh to eat as prasad, a sacred offering. Others meditate while seated on bloated, river-washed cadavers, their stillness undisturbed by the stench of decay. The most extreme practice, Kapala Kriya, drinking from human skulls filled with rotting brain matter and Ganges water, believing this cocktail dissolves the ego's last vestiges. To outsiders, it's abhorrent. To the Aghori, it's the ultimate act of devotion. Their guiding principle, Shivaham, I am Shiva, reflects their goal to see the divine in what society deems most repulsive. But this isn't mindless shock value. Every act is rooted in centuries-old tantric scripture, particularly the Kulanava Tantra, which instructs adepts to worship with the impure to attain the pure. The corpses they use are always those denied traditional cremation, unclaimed bodies, suicide victims, or the excommunicated. By interacting with these untouchable dead, Aghorists seek to dismantle caste, gender, and even the line between life and death. Their signature ash smearing, called vibhuti, comes from funeral pyres and serves as a constant memento mori, a reminder that the body is temporary and all social constructs mere illusions. Modern forensic studies of Aghori practices reveal startling biological risks. Pathologists warn that handling decomposing flesh exposes them to deadly pathogens like hepatitis and necrotizing bacteria, yet many Aghorists show uncanny resistance. Some attribute this to their rigorous diet of neem leaves and datura, plants with antiviral properties used in controlled doses. Others point to their extreme mental conditioning. Decades of exposure inure them to disgust, rewiring the brain's insular cortex, which processes aversion. MRI scans of long-term practitioners show diminished activity in areas associated with fear and disgust responses, suggesting their rituals physically alter perception. Yet the most profound Aghori rituals happen beyond public view. During the secretive Chinnamasta Vrata, initiates symbolically decapitate themselves before a tantric goddess, entering trances where they envision consuming their own flesh. At midnight in cremation grounds, they perform Maithuna, ritual intercourse with corpses, not for pleasure but to confront the ultimate taboo and transcend desire itself. These acts aren't recorded or photographed, they're experiential, meant to shatter the practitioner's conditioned mind. Western seekers sometimes romanticize the Aghoris, mistaking their extremism for enlightenment. But genuine adepts dismiss such fetishization. "You think eating shit makes you free," scoffed one monk when questioned by an eager tourist. "First learn to see shit in gold." Their path isn't about rebellion but recognition that liberation lies not in rejecting societal norms but in seeing through them entirely. The Aghori's greatest lesson isn't in their shocking acts but in their radical equality. They'll share a skull bowl with an untouchable, meditate beside a rotting dog, or bless a billionaire with the same ash-stained hand. In a world obsessed with categorizing pure/impure, sacred/profane, self/other, they stand as living paradoxes, their very existence a challenge to every certainty we hold. The cremation fires they tend don't just burn bodies, they incinerate illusions, leaving behind only the question: if enlightenment exists beyond disgust, how far are we willing to go to find it? In the shadow of Babylon's ziggurats, where the scent of burning cedar mingled with the iron tang of fresh blood, priests performed a ritual that would decide the fates of kings. Haruspice, the art of divining the future through animal entrails, wasn't guesswork but a precise science to the Mesopotamians, and no organ held more secrets than the liver. When a general planned a campaign or a merchant contemplated a voyage, they didn't consult maps or ledgers. They brought a sacrificial sheep to the temple and waited as the Baru priest slit its belly, searching the glistening lobes and veins for messages from the gods. The process was methodical. After selecting an unblemished animal, typically a young lamb or goat, the priest would cleanse it with water from the Euphrates, whispering incantations to Shamash, the sun god and patron of divination. A single cut exposed the liver, its surface immediately inspected for abnormalities. A dark spot might signify an enemy's betrayal, while an unusually shaped gallbladder could warn of famine. Clay tablets from Mari detail over 50 distinct liver features, each with its own interpretation. One such tablet describes a path of the king vein. If it branched left, the ruler would fall ill. If right, his reign would flourish. What shocks modern scholars isn't the superstition but the sophistication. At Sipar, archaeologists uncovered a classroom littered with clay liver models, each painstakingly molded to teach apprentice priests. These weren't abstract sculptures but precise anatomical replicas, complete with labeled sections like the Palace Gate or the Seat of Anu. Trainees would spend years memorizing every bump and fissure, diagnosing hypothetical scenarios scribed in cuneiform alongside the models. One particularly intricate example from the British Museum shows a liver split into 60 regions, each annotated with possible omens, a testament to the Babylonians' belief that the divine spoke in the language of physiology. The sheer volume of surviving records reveals how deeply this practice permeated society. The library of Ashurbanipal contained over 800 omen tablets, some outlining chains of causality so specific they read like medical textbooks. If the right lobe is swollen and bears 3 white spots, warns one entry, the army will cross a river in flood and the king's son shall drown. Kings ignored these signs at their peril. A letter to Zimri Lim of Mari recounts how his rival ignored a priest's warning about a split lobe and lost 600 soldiers in a botched ambush. Modern science offers eerie validation of the Babylonians' obsession. The liver is the body's primary detoxifier, making it uniquely sensitive to environmental changes. Toxins, diseases, or even dietary shifts can alter its appearance, meaning a diseased liver omen might have reflected real contamination in water supplies or spoiled temple grain. Researchers analyzing Hittite accounts found correlations between darkened lobe omens and subsequent outbreaks of ergot poisoning from tainted rye. The priests, unaware of microbiology, had stumbled onto a crude form of public health monitoring. Yet the darkest aspect of haruspicy wasn't its accuracy but its psychological grip. Excavations at Nineveh revealed confirmation tablets, records where priests retroactively found omens predicting disasters that had already occurred. Like a self-correcting algorithm, the system ensured its own infallibility, weaving hindsight into prophecy. A general might march to victory and thank the gods for a favorable liver reading, while his defeated counterpart would blame his own misinterpretation, never the ritual itself. This feedback loop made haruspicy impervious to failure, embedding it in Mesopotamian culture for millennia. Today, the closest parallel isn't medicine but artificial intelligence, both systems deriving patterns from data opaque to laypeople. Those clay models in museums aren't just curiosities. They're relics of humanity's first attempt to force order onto chaos, to sculpt certainty from the slippery flesh of uncertainty. The Babylonians didn't just read livers, they wrote the blueprint for how societies manufacture meaning, one sacrificial victim at a time. In the dense forests of the Ivory Coast, young Senufo boys endured a transformation that turned skin into living canvas. Their initiation into the Poro society didn't involve written tests or speeches, just the searing drag of a razor-sharp knife across their backs, carving patterns that would forever mark their passage to manhood. This was scarification, not as punishment but as sacred text etched in flesh. Across West Africa, from the Dinka of South Sudan to the Yoruba of Nigeria, raised scars served as both rite of passage and resume, broadcasting one's courage, lineage, and social standing to anyone who knew how to read the raised hieroglyphics of skin. The tools varied by region but shared a brutal simplicity. Among the Maasai, acacia thorns pierced the skin in symmetrical rows, while the Bamalk of Cameroon used obsidian flakes to chisel geometric designs onto chests and faces. What made the process truly agonizing wasn't just the cutting, but the aftercare: ashes, clay, or even crushed termite mound soil packed into the wounds to prevent clean healing, ensuring scars formed thick and proud. Elders in the Karo tribe of Ethiopia mixed charcoal with milk to create an ink-like paste, rubbing it into fresh incisions to produce blue-black reliefs that shimmered under sunlight. These weren't mere decorations, they were survival maps. A keloid scar pattern on a woman's belly might signal fertility, while parallel lines on a warrior's arm could tally enemies slain. Archaeological evidence reveals how deeply these traditions were rooted. Excavated knock terracotta figurines from 500 B.C. show precise facial scar patterns still used by modern tribes, proving the practice survived millennia. Among the Dinka, initiates as young as 12 underwent gar, marking 6 parallel forehead cuts representing the horns of their prized cattle. The pain was intentional. A boy who flinched might be denied marriage prospects, his unmarked face branding him a coward. French colonial records from Senegal describe Wolof women singing praise songs during scarification ceremonies, their melodies timed to the rhythm of the knife strokes, an ancient form of anesthesia through distraction. Modern dermatology has uncovered surprising medical wisdom behind the ritual. The ash packed into wounds acted as a natural antiseptic, while certain clay mixtures contained kaolin, now known to promote clotting. Some patterns weren't random but followed lymphatic pathways, avoiding major nerves and blood vessels, knowledge passed down through generations of cutters. Yet the psychological impact cut deepest. Anthropologists studying the Beta Maraib of Benin found initiates with facial scars reported higher social confidence, their markings functioning like permanent badges of belonging. A Krobo elder once told researchers, "The pain stays in your skin so it doesn't stay in your heart," framing scarification as emotional alchemy transforming fear into pride. The decline of these practices under colonial rule reveals their cultural weight. Missionaries condemned scarification as pagan mutilation, not realizing they were erasing living libraries. Each pattern held ancestral knowledge. A Dagomba man's cheek scars might encode his great-grandfather's migration route, while a Sama woman's torso markings could map her clan's sacred geography. Today, some urban youths reclaim these traditions with tattoo ink instead of knives, but the original rites persist in remote areas. At a Bamaun palace in Cameroon, historians documented the king's scarifier, an elderly woman who still used the same iron blade her foremothers wielded, its edge kept sharp with river stones. What outsiders saw as brutality, these cultures saw as rebirth. The scarred didn't hide their marks, they displayed them like medals, their bodies narrating stories no parchment could preserve. In a world now obsessed with erasing scars, these traditions whisper an unsettling question: what if some wounds aren't meant to fade but to speak? The frozen banks of the Volga River bore witness to a funeral that would haunt Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan for the rest of his days. In his meticulous 10th century account, he described a Viking chieftain's ship being dragged ashore, its hull packed with treasures, silken fabrics, fruit, even a lute, as if preparing for a luxurious journey. Then came the chilling climax. A young enslaved woman, perhaps Slavic or Baltic, was given a final meal before being passed between warriors who each took turns with her, declaring, "Tell your master I did this out of love for him." As the death ritual reached its peak, an elderly woman called the Angel of Death looped a cord around the girl's neck, pulling taut while 2 men yanked the opposite ends. The convulsions lasted minutes before the body was placed beside her master in the ship, now transformed into a floating tomb destined for flames. This wasn't isolated cruelty but sacred theater to the Norse. They believed the freshly strangled slave would awaken in Valhalla as the chief's eternal attendant, her death granting her privileged passage to the warrior's paradise. Ibn Fadlan's horrified account aligns with archaeological evidence from Scandinavia: skeletons buried with broken cervical vertebrae, their hands bound behind them in intricate knot patterns resembling those used to secure sails. At the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, 2 women interred with a queen showed signs of ritual asphyxiation, their hyoid bones fractured in ways consistent with strangulation rather than hanging. The mechanics of these sacrifices reveal calculated brutality. Unlike quick battlefield killings, ritual strangulation prolonged suffering deliberately, as the thrall's fading breath was thought to carry prayers directly to Odin. Some graves contain multiple victims, like those at Gladiator on the Isle of Man, where a young woman was strangled atop a pile of already slain companions. Forensic analysis shows the executioners adjusted their methods based on victim status. High-ranking attendants might receive a ceremonial cord woven with gold threads, while war captives were dispatched with rough hemp ropes that left telltale fiber fragments in their tooth enamel from biting down in agony. What unsettles modern observers most isn't just the violence, but its communal nature. Ibn Fadlan describes the girl drinking and laughing with her killers hours before her death, even volunteering for the honor, a detail scholars debate as either Stockholm Syndrome or careful scripting by the Norsemen. The ritual incorporated elements of marriage ceremony, with the slave dressed in bridal finery before her symbolic union with death. This blurring of celebration and sacrifice appears in other Norse sources too. The Saga of Herva tells of thralls hanged with honey cakes in their mouths, their deaths framed as both offering and initiation into the afterlife's feast. The psychological underpinnings of these rituals become clearer when examining Norse cosmology. Their universe required constant replenishment. Ships needed rowers, halls needed serving girls, and Valhalla's Einherjar warriors required companions. By sending intact bodies, unlike cremation which dissolved physical form, they ensured the dead arrived whole in the next world. A decapitated skeleton found in Repton, England, clutching a Thor's hammer amulet suggests some victims embraced this fate willingly, believing their sacrifice guaranteed a place among the gods. Modern excavations continue to uncover layers of complexity. At Flakstad in Norway, DNA analysis revealed several strangled individuals were actually Norse themselves, not slaves but possibly criminals or volunteers seeking redemption through service in death. Other sites show children subjected to the same rites, their small neck bones bearing the unmistakable marks of ritual cords. These finds challenge simplistic narratives, revealing a belief system where violence and transcendence were inextricably linked, and where the line between victim and acolyte vanished in the smoke of funeral pyres. The legacy of these practices echoes in unexpected ways. Contemporary Asatru followers debate whether to include such dark aspects in reconstructed Norse faith, while historians note parallels in other cultures, from Chinese jade burial suits meant to preserve aristocrats' forms to Egyptian Ushabti figurines serving as ghostly laborers. But the Viking ship burials stand apart for their unflinching intimacy, their insistence that power in the next world required brutality in this one. The ropes around those thralls' necks weren't just killing tools, they were umbilical cords tethering two realms, each tug ensuring another soul's passage into myth. From flaying priests to poisoned oracles, from child sacrifices to self-mummifying monks, we've ventured through history's most unsettling rituals, each revealing how easily societies sanctify cruelty in the name of tradition, duty, or divine will. The Aztec priest wearing a victim's skin like ceremonial robes, the Viking thrall strangled with gilded cords, the Spartan elder inspecting newborns like livestock, these weren't aberrations but celebrated norms. What unites them is the terrifying human capacity to rationalize horror, to cloak brutality in sacred vestments until the unthinkable becomes inevitable. Consider the chilling parallels across cultures. The Incancapacocha children, drugged into serenity before their mountain tombs sealed shut, mirror the foregone verdicts of European witch trials where confession was guaranteed by the turning of screws. The Roman crowds cheering as gladiators bled mirrored the Aghori monks smearing corpse ash on their skin, both seeking transcendence through proximity to death, one as spectacle, the other as sacrament. Even our modern world isn't immune. The lead pipes of antiquity find their echo in today's forever chemicals, while institutionalized control over bodies persists, whether through colonial bans on scarification or courtroom battles over autonomy. Yet these practices also demand uncomfortable questions. Were the Maya's psychedelic enemas truly more extreme than our own pharmaceutical experiments? Is the Celtic headhunter's trophy so different from the military's obsession with kill counts? History's darkest rituals hold up a fractured mirror, forcing us to ask what future generations will recoil at in our behavior. The real horror isn't that these things happened, but that their perpetrators believed truly, fervently, they were right. As the smoke clears from this journey through humanity's shadowed corners, one thread remains. The line between barbarism and civilization is drawn in sand, not stone. Which ritual left you most unsettled? Was it the calculated eugenics of Sparta or the industrial-scale animal mummification of Egypt? The living flutes made from human bones or the mothers who bound their daughters' feet with silk and agony? Drop your thoughts below. This is one conversation where every perspective adds depth to the darkness. And if you've made it this far through the forbidden and the forgotten, consider subscribing. The past has more secrets to spill, and we're just getting started.